The coffee pot was still warm when I walked into my kitchen at 6:47 a.m., earlier than usual because I couldn't sleep, my feet bare on the cold tile as I reached for a mug from the cabinet. And that's when I heard them. My husband Warren's voice drifting through the partially open door to his office, calm and measured, followed by his mother Eleanor's familiar clipped tone, responding with equal composure. And I froze with my hand on the mug handle, because they weren't arguing or laughing. They were planning, discussing something with the kind of careful deliberation people use when making important decisions. And Eleanor said clearly, once we have everything properly arranged, she won't be able to interfere. And Warren replied, the timing has to be perfect. We can't rush this or she'll catch on. And my heart began hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat as I set the mug down silently and moved closer to the door, my whole body trembling, because the she they were discussing with such cold calculation was me, his wife of 12 years, and they were talking about my life, my future, my autonomy, like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. And Eleanor continued, the financial advisor said we need her signatures by the end of the month. After that, the restructuring will be irreversible. And Warren's response made my knees weak. Good, she trusts me. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. And I backed away from that door on shaking legs, my hand pressed to my mouth to keep from making a sound, because I had just heard my husband and his mother, calmly, methodically, discussing how to reorganize my entire existence without my knowledge or consent. My name is Natalie Donnelly, and until that morning, I thought I knew exactly who I was. A 43-year-old woman with a steady accounting job at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, a comfortable home in the suburbs, a marriage that seemed solid if not passionate, and a life that ran on routine and reasonable compromise. The kind of person who kept her head down, avoided conflict, made things work, never caused drama or demanded too much attention. Always the peacemaker at family gatherings, always the one who adjusted her schedule, changed her plans, smoothed over disagreements, because that's what good wives did, or so I'd been taught by my mother and reinforced by Eleanor from the day Warren brought me home to meet her. I'd been married to Warren for 12 years, together for 14, and we'd built what looked from the outside like a stable middle-class life. No children by choice, both of us working, managing bills together, taking modest vacations, attending his family's holiday dinners, living in a 3-bedroom house his mother had helped us purchase, with a down payment that came with unspoken strings, babe. I was only beginning to understand. I was good at my job, reliable, competent, earning $68,000 a year with benefits, contributing equally to our household, maybe more when Warren's sales commissions dipped, and I'd always been proud of my ability to handle my own finances, my own responsibilities, my own life. Except lately I'd noticed how often Warren consulted his mother about our decisions, how Eleanor's opinions carried more weight than mine, how I'd become the easy one, the quiet one, the one whose silence was mistaken for agreement. And that silence, I was beginning to understand, had made me vulnerable in ways I'd never imagined possible. 2 days after I overheard that conversation, Eleanor arrived at our house unannounced with a casserole and concern etched across her face, like she'd practiced it in the mirror, settling onto our sofa with theatrical worry while Warren hovered nearby, and she started with, Natalie, honey, we need to talk about something that's been weighing on us. And I sat across from them in the armchair, my hands folded calmly in my lap though my pulse was racing, as Eleanor continued, we've noticed you seem overwhelmed lately, stressed, not quite yourself, and we're worried about your well-being. Her voice dripping with false compassion. And Warren nodded along like a trained dog, adding, you've been distant, preoccupied, forgetting things. And I stared at them both, my face carefully neutral, because I hadn't forgotten anything, hadn't been distant or stressed beyond normal work deadlines. But Eleanor pressed on. It's nothing to be ashamed of, dear. Many women your age struggle with hormones, pressure, emotional regulation, and the phrase emotional regulation hit me like a slap, because it was clinical, deliberate, the kind of language used to dismiss women's legitimate anger as hysteria. And Warren said gently, we just want to make sure you're taken care of, that you're not carrying burdens you don't need to carry. And I realized with cold clarity that this narrative, Natalie is fragile, Natalie is overwhelmed, Natalie isn't managing well, had been constructed carefully, rehearsed between them, and probably shared with others already, laying groundwork for something larger. And when I asked calmly, "Who else have you discussed this with?" Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly before she recovered with, "Just family, people who care about you." And I knew then that the story of my supposed instability had already been planted in fertile soil, ready to grow into justification for whatever they were planning. And I smiled and thanked them for their concern, while inside something hard and cold began to form. The following Sunday, Warren suggested we sit down together to organize our finances, spreading papers across the dining room table, while Eleanor conveniently stopped by with coffee and pastries, and I watched them arrange documents with practiced efficiency. Bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds, insurance policies, everything laid out like evidence in a case I hadn't known was being built against me. And Warren explained in his reasonable salesman voice that he'd been working with a financial advisor, Eleanor's recommendation, of course, who'd suggested some restructuring to maximize our assets, minimize taxes, prepare for the future, all very sensible and temporary, just until things were properly optimized. And he slid papers toward me, marked with neon tabs where my signature was needed, and Eleanor chimed in about how smart it was to plan ahead, to make sure everything was protected, to ensure I'd be taken care of if anything happened. And I noticed how the language shifted, from our assets to protected assets, from joint accounts to managed accounts, from equal access to my access shrinking while Warren's expanded. And the word temporary appeared in fine print, with definitions that made it anything but temporary. Clauses about decision-making authority, financial oversight, restructured ownership, that would require both signatures to undo but only one to implement. And Warren smiled warmly and said, "You trust me, right? This is just paperwork, formality, nothing changes between us." And Eleanor patted my hand and added, "Warren knows what's best for the family." And I picked up my pen slowly, watching them both relax slightly, confident I would sign just as I'd always signed, always agreed, always accommodated. And I set the pen down and said quietly, "I need time to read these thoroughly. I'll take them to work tomorrow and review them during lunch." And the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees as Warren's smile tightened and Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but I gathered the papers calmly, thanked them for their concern, and walked upstairs, knowing they hadn't expected me to actually read anything. Easter dinner at Eleanor's sprawling colonial house was always a performance, and this year I watched it unfold with new clarity as 30 relatives gathered around her mahogany table, and conversations about my life happened as if I were invisible. Eleanor announced to Warren's Aunt Pamela that we're simplifying Natalie's workload. She's been so stressed. While I sat 3 feet away, and Warren told his cousin that Mom's helping us get our finances straightened out. Natalie's never been great with numbers. A lie so blatant I nearly choked on my ham, considering I was a certified accountant. And his brother Nathan asked me directly about our summer plans. And before I could answer, Warren interjected, "We're staying local this year. Natalie needs rest more than travel." Deciding my vacation without consultation. And when I attempted to correct him, to say actually I'd been hoping to visit my sister in Colorado, Eleanor cut me off with, "Oh, Natalie, you know how exhausted you've been. A long trip would be too much right now." And the table murmured agreement. Everyone nodding along to this narrative of my fragility that had somehow become accepted fact, and I felt myself disappearing, my voice erased, my preferences overridden, my existence reduced to something they discussed and decided, while I sat among them like a child whose opinion didn't matter. And after dinner, when I tried to help clear dishes, Eleanor physically took plates from my hands, saying, "You rest. Dear, you've done enough." And Warren guided me to the living room like I needed assistance walking, and I sat on that chintz sofa, watching them all move through Eleanor's house, making decisions, telling stories, living fully, while I'd been demoted to someone who needed management. And I made a choice then. I stopped correcting them, stopped protesting, stopped explaining myself. Because every word I spoke in my own defense was being used as evidence of instability. Every assertion of my capability twisted into proof of denial, and my silence that afternoon wasn't surrender, though they clearly believed it was. It was strategy, and they grew comfortable in my quietness, careless, convinced they'd finally gotten me to accept my place. The shift in my approach was immediate and deliberate. I became agreeable, compliant, easy, nodding when Eleanor called with suggestions about my diet and exercise, thanking Warren when he scheduled appointments for me without asking, smiling when they spoke over me or made plans that affected my life. And I watched them relax into this new dynamic, like it confirmed everything they'd believed about me all along. That I'd been difficult before and reasonable now. That their concern had been valid and their control necessary. And Warren actually told me one evening, "I'm glad you're finally letting us help you." I was worried for a while there. And I murmured something about appreciating their support, while inside I was cataloging every conversation, every decision made without me, every instance of them discussing my competence like it was up for debate. And I started keeping notes on my phone using the encrypted app my coworker had recommended. Dates, times, direct quotes when possible, witnesses present, documents presented, decisions made. Building a detailed record, not because I knew exactly what I'd need it for, but because I understood instinctively that truth requires evidence, and memory can be challenged, but documentation cannot. And I observed how Eleanor controlled Warren not through obvious domination, but through subtle validation. How she rewarded his agreement with approval, and punished his independence with withdrawal. And I saw how he'd learned to anticipate her preferences, and present them as his own decisions. And I understood that fighting them openly would only provide ammunition for their narrative that I was unstable, combative, unable to manage my own well-being. So instead I went quiet and careful and started gathering information. And they mistook my silence for surrender. My compliance for defeat, and they grew comfortable, stopped watching their words around me, stopped hiding their coordination. And that comfort would become their mistake, because while they thought they were winning, I was preparing. 3 weeks into my new strategy, Eleanor made her first significant error during a casual Wednesday evening visit, sitting at our kitchen counter drinking tea, and she mentioned offhandedly, "I was telling Brenda at book club how your performance review showed you've been struggling with attention to detail lately." And my blood went cold, because my performance review was confidential, conducted by my supervisor, never shared with Warren, never discussed at home, and I'd actually received excellent marks across all categories including attention to detail. And I asked carefully, "How did you know about my performance review?" And Eleanor's face flickered with something, realization, maybe concern, before she recovered smoothly. "Oh, Warren mentioned something, didn't you, honey?" And Warren looked genuinely confused, saying, "I don't think Natalie told me about any review." And Eleanor waved it away. "Well, someone did. Maybe I'm mixing it up with someone else's situation." But I knew she wasn't mixing anything up. She'd referenced specific language from my actual review, twisted to serve her narrative, which meant someone at my workplace was feeding her information. Or she'd accessed it somehow. And the realization that her data collection extended beyond casual observation into active surveillance made my hands shake slightly, as I excused myself to the bathroom and sat on the closed toilet lid, trying to breathe steadily, because this went deeper than I'd understood. More coordinated, more invasive. And when I returned to the kitchen, Eleanor was already leaving, kissing Warren goodbye with extra warmth. And after she left, I asked him directly, "Have you been asking people about me? Checking up on me?" And he looked genuinely offended. "Of course not. Why would I do that?" And I believed he was telling the truth, which meant Eleanor was operating independently, gathering intelligence through her own networks, building a case with evidence I hadn't known she was collecting. And that night, I couldn't sleep. Lying beside my husband in the dark, wondering who else was reporting to her, what other private information she'd obtained, how deep this scheme actually went. I discovered the extent of their coordination completely by accident when Warren's calendar notification dinged on the iPad we shared for household scheduling. And the alert read, "Meeting with Attorney Caldwell, Estate Planning, scheduled for Thursday at 2 p.m., and I knew we had no estate planning appointment, had never discussed needing one. And when I opened the calendar app fully, I found a pattern of meetings I'd never been informed about. 3 appointments with Caldwell over the past 6 weeks, 2 meetings with someone named Harrison at First National Bank, a consultation with Dr. Shepard, whose specialty I Googled and found was geriatric psychiatry, though neither Warren nor I were anywhere near geriatric, and a recurring Monday evening entry simply labeled family meeting that corresponded exactly with nights. Warren said he was working late or meeting clients, and the truth landed on me like physical weight. They'd been meeting regularly without me, building something, planning something, consulting professionals, and making decisions about my life, while I sat home believing my marriage was a partnership. And I took screenshots of everything, sent them to my personal email, then cleared the notification and closed the iPad. And that evening when Warren came home, I asked casually how his day was, and he said, "Busy, just the usual client stuff." A lie delivered with comfortable ease. And I smiled and asked about dinner, playing my role perfectly, while understanding that my marriage had become a performance where only I didn't know the script. And later that week I drove past Caldwell's office building downtown, a glass tower housing corporate attorneys who didn't handle simple estate planning. And I understood these weren't meetings about our future together. They were meetings about separating me from any power I currently held, legal groundwork being laid while I was deliberately excluded, and the loneliness hit me hard then. Sitting in my car in that parking lot, realizing I'd been sleeping beside someone who was actively plotting against me, who met with lawyers to discuss my life like I was an obstacle rather than a partner. I made my own appointment on a Tuesday morning, using a personal day from work, driving 40 minutes to a town where I wouldn't accidentally encounter anyone I knew. Meeting with an attorney named Patricia Hernandez, whose office was modest, but whose reputation for family law was excellent. And I told her everything calmly: the overheard conversation, the documents Warren wanted me to sign, the meetings he was attending without me, Eleanor's surveillance, the narrative of instability being constructed around me. And Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, her expression professional but her eyes sharp with recognition. And when I finished, she said, "You're describing financial coercion and potential undue influence. What you've documented is valuable." And she explained that the papers Warren had presented were more aggressive than I'd realized, that signing them would have given him sole control over joint assets, that the temporary language was deliberately vague and likely unenforceable in my favor, that the appointments with a geriatric psychiatrist suggested they were building a case for some form of conservatorship or incompetence claim, though I was decades too young and clearly capable. And she said bluntly, "They're trying to establish that you can't manage your own affairs. It's not uncommon when someone wants control of assets without going through divorce." And I felt sick hearing it stated so plainly. And Patricia asked, "Do you want to save this marriage?" And I realized I hadn't for a while, maybe hadn't ever truly wanted it, but had been performing the role of satisfied wife so long I'd lost track of what I actually felt. And I said quietly, "I want to protect myself." And she nodded. "Then here's what we're going to do." And over the next 90 minutes she outlined a strategy. Document everything, change nothing in my behavior yet, secure my own accounts quietly, prepare but don't react. Wait for them to make the next move because defensive positions are stronger than offensive ones. And I left her office with copies of information about my rights, my options, and most importantly, my power, which turned out to be considerably more than they'd counted on. The pressure increased noticeably after Memorial Day, like they'd set some internal deadline and time was running short, Warren growing more insistent about the financial documents, saying we needed to finalize things before the end of June for tax purposes, a reason that made no sense since taxes weren't due until April. And Eleanor started calling daily, sometimes twice, always with the same underlying message delivered in different packaging. I wasn't managing well, I needed support, cooperation would prove stability. And one Sunday afternoon, they both sat me down in our living room with a new set of papers, simpler this time, and Warren said, "Natalie, I need you to trust me on this. The longer we wait, the more complicated it gets. And Eleanor added, "Honey, people are starting to notice you're not yourself. Let us handle the financial stress so you can focus on feeling better." And I felt the trap closing, their urgency revealing that something was time-sensitive on their end, some plan that required my signature before a specific date. And Warren's voice took on an edge. "I've been patient, I've tried to explain this gently, but I need you to sign these papers. This week, no more delays." And Eleanor's warmth evaporated slightly. "Natalie, resistance at this point only proves what we've been concerned about, your inability to make rational decisions in your own best interest." And there it was, the quiet part said louder, the threat wrapped in concern. If I didn't cooperate willingly, my lack of cooperation would become evidence against me, proof of instability, justification for whatever came next. And I looked at both of them, my husband of 12 years and his mother who'd never truly accepted me, and I said softly, "I just need a little more time to understand everything." And Warren stood abruptly, "No more time. You sign by Friday or I'm making decisions without you. I have the legal right." And Eleanor touched his arm gently, reeling him back. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Natalie will do the right thing. Won't you, dear?" And I nodded, because fighting now would accomplish nothing except exposing that I understood their game. And after they left, I sat in the silence of my own home, feeling like a stranger in it, wondering what would happen Friday when I didn't sign, what consequences they'd already prepared. The email arrived Thursday evening at 6:43 p.m., not to me but to Warren's personal account that we'd set up years ago on our shared desktop computer for household bills. And I only saw it because I was checking our utility statement when the notification popped up. Sender listed as Caldwell.law, subject line, final documents, reviewed. And I hesitated only a moment before opening it, my heart pounding. And there in professional legal language was the proof I'd been waiting for, an email from Attorney Caldwell outlining the strategy they'd discussed, referencing concerns about Natalie's capacity to manage finances, recommending pursuing conservatorship proceedings if signature is not obtained by June 30th, detailing how Eleanor had provided documentation of my alleged instability, including statements from family members and behavioral observations, and most damning, a line that read, "As discussed, the timing is critical given that joint assets currently total $340,000, and any division in traditional divorce would be costly, whereas the proposed restructuring maintains control while appearing collaborative." And I sat staring at that screen, understanding fully now. This wasn't about protecting me or our marriage, it was about taking everything I'd worked for, every dollar I'd contributed over 12 years, everything. And the word conservatorship meant they wanted legal authority over my life, over me, wanted to have me declared incompetent, so they could control not just our money, but my ability to make any decisions at all. And the casual cruelty of it, the calculated manipulation, the months of careful groundwork to paint me as unstable, all laid out in black and white in an email that was supposed to remain private between conspirators. And my hands shook as I forwarded it to my personal account, then to Patricia Hernandez, with the subject line, "Evidence," then deleted it from Warren's trash folder and cleared the notification. And I sat back in the desk chair in our quiet house and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, though that was there, but a cold clarity, a understanding that the marriage was already over, had been over for months while I'd been performing the role of unsuspecting wife, and now all that remained was making sure I walked away with my dignity and my rights intact. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and spent the day methodically securing everything that mattered. I opened a new checking account at a different bank in my name only, transferred exactly half of our joint savings, which was legally mine, regardless of what documents Warren wanted me to sign, set up new passwords on all my personal accounts, and enabled two-factor authentication, gathered copies of every important document, marriage certificate, property deed, car title, insurance policies, tax returns for the past 5 years, bank statements, investment records, scanning everything and storing it in a secure cloud account Warren didn't know existed. And I changed my direct deposit information so my paychecks would now go to my new account, called my HR department. and placed a note on my file that no information should be released to anyone without my written authorization. Then I stopped by my doctor's office and asked for a full physical and mental health evaluation documented in writing, explaining I needed proof of my competence. And Dr. Palmer looked concerned but didn't ask questions, just scheduled me for the following week and made notes in my chart. I worked efficiently, calmly, without drama, and by evening everything that could be protected was protected. Everything that could be documented was documented, and I'd done nothing illegal, nothing unethical, nothing that couldn't be explained as responsible financial management. And when Warren came home that night, I was cooking dinner normally. And he seemed relieved, saying, "I'm glad you're feeling better about everything," assuming my sick day had been emotional distress rather than strategic preparation. And I smiled and said, "Dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. And he kissed my forehead like nothing was wrong. Like he hadn't spent months plotting to take my autonomy. And I served pot roast and potatoes while he talked about his day. And I thought about how he still believed he was winning. How they both did. How their confidence would be their downfall because people who think they've already won stop being careful. And I was counting on that. Monday morning, Warren casually mentioned that he'd scheduled an appointment for me. "Just a checkup, nothing major, Dr. Shepard. He's supposed to be excellent." And I recognized the name immediately from Warren's calendar, the geriatric psychiatrist, and I felt my pulse spike but kept my voice level as I asked, "Why did you schedule a doctor for me without asking?" And Warren sighed like I was being difficult. "Because you won't do it yourself, Natalie. You've been struggling and you need professional help. Mom and I both think." And I cut him off, something I never did. "I'm not going to an appointment I didn't schedule with a doctor I didn't choose. If I need help, I'll find my own doctor." And his face changed, hardened. "You're going to that appointment, Natalie. Friday at 10 a.m. It's already arranged." And I said quietly but firmly, "No, I'm not." And we stared at each other across our kitchen island, and I saw panic flicker in his eyes because this wasn't part of the script. I was supposed to be compliant now, broken down by their pressure. And he tried another approach. Softer. "Baby, please, I'm worried about you. Just go to one appointment. If you don't like him, we'll find someone else." But I shook my head. "I don't need a psychiatrist, Warren. I'm not unstable, I'm not incompetent, and I'm not signing your papers or attending appointments I don't consent to." And saying it out loud, claiming my own authority, felt like breaking through water after being held under, and Warren's mask dropped completely. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you, and you're acting exactly like someone who needs help." And I recognize the circular logic. Resistance proves instability. And I said calmly, "I'm going to work now. Cancel the appointment." And I picked up my bag and walked out while he called after me, his voice rising with an edge I'd rarely heard. And when I got to my car, my hands were shaking, but I'd done it. I'd refused. I'd drawn a boundary, and his panic told me everything I needed to know. The appointment was crucial to their plan, probably meant to provide documentation of my supposed incompetence. And without my cooperation, their entire carefully constructed narrative started to crumble. And I drove to work thinking about Friday, wondering what they'd do when I didn't show up, how far they were willing to take this. Eleanor arrived at our house Friday evening unannounced. And I knew immediately that Warren had told her about my refusal because her warmth was completely gone, replaced by cold precision, and she didn't bother with pleasantries, just walked into our living room where I was reading and said, "We need to talk, Natalie. This behavior needs to stop." And I closed my book and looked at her and she continued, "Your refusal to cooperate is concerning. Your resistance to help is concerning. Your attitude lately is concerning." And I noticed how she repeated the word concerning, building a narrative, and she sat down across from me without being invited and said, "Warren has been extremely patient with you, more patient than most men would be, and you repay him with stubbornness and defiance." And I felt anger flash hot in my chest but kept my voice level. "I'm not defiant, Eleanor. I'm capable, I'm employed, I'm managing my life perfectly well. What I'm not doing is signing away my rights or attending appointments I don't consent to." And her expression turned icy. You're proving exactly why we're concerned. Capable women don't fight their own families. Stable women don't refuse reasonable help. And there it was again, the circular logic that made resistance evidence of instability. And then she said something that clarified everything. Warren is the head of this household, Natalie. That's how marriage works. Wives support their husbands' decisions. They don't question. They don't resist. They certainly don't embarrass their husbands by acting paranoid and difficult. And I stared at her, understanding fully now. This was never about my well-being or our marriage. It was about control, about power, about Eleanor's belief that wives should be subordinate, and that my independence threatened her worldview. And I said quietly, I think you should leave, and she laughed, actually laughed. This is my son's house. I'll leave when I'm ready. And something in me hardened completely, and I stood, no, Eleanor. This is my house too, and I'm asking you to leave now. And she looked at Warren, who'd appeared in the doorway. Are you going to let her speak to your mother this way? And Warren looked between us, trapped, and I saw him choose Natalie, apologize to my mother, and I picked up my phone and said calmly, leave now, or I'm calling the police for trespassing. And Eleanor's face went red, but she stood, gathering her purse, and said to Warren, you see what she's become? You see why we need to act? And she left, and Warren and I stood in the silence she'd left behind, and I knew the marriage was over, had probably been over for years, and all that remained was making it official. I told Warren the following Tuesday after dinner, when we were both calm and the house was quiet, and I said simply, I want a divorce. And he stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, and then his face cycled through shock to anger, to something that looked like genuine panic. And he said, you can't be serious. Over what? A disagreement with my mother? And I shook my head. This isn't about one disagreement. This is about months of you planning to take my autonomy, my finances, my voice. This is about you meeting with lawyers behind my back. This is about forged narratives and manipulated concerns and a psychiatrist appointment I never consented to. And his face paled. How did you? And then he caught himself, but it was too late. He'd confirmed everything, and he shifted tactics immediately. Natalie, you're misunderstanding everything. We were trying to protect you, to help you. And I said, no, Warren. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. And he moved closer, his voice dropping to that persuasive salesman tone. Baby, we can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can start over. Please. I love you. But I heard the desperation beneath the words, not love but fear. Fear of divorce, of asset division, of losing control of the narrative. And I said, I've already consulted an attorney. I'll be fair. We'll divide everything equitably. But the marriage is over. And he tried begging then, actually dropped into a chair with his head in his hands. You're destroying everything. Think about what you're throwing away. Think about our life together. And I thought about our life. 12 years of making myself smaller, quieter, easier, of being dismissed and overlooked and managed, of loving someone who saw me as something to control rather than a partner to respect. And I said, I have thought about it. That's why I'm leaving. And I walked upstairs to our bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling simultaneously terrified and more free than I'd felt in years. And I knew the hardest part was still coming. But the decision was made. Irreversible. Mine. Patricia scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday at her office, neutral ground, with Warren, his attorney, Eleanor, who insisted on attending, and me. And I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed professionally, carrying a folder of documents that felt heavy with truth. And when Warren and Eleanor walked in with Richard Buchanan, an expensive attorney whose presence revealed how seriously they were taking this, I felt my stomach clench, but kept my expression calm, and Patricia began formally. We're here to discuss the dissolution of the marriage between Natalie and Warren Donnelly, and to ensure both parties understand the situation clearly. And Richard started with, my client is willing to be generous in the divorce settlement given the circumstances. And Patricia raised an eyebrow. What circumstances? And Richard glanced at Eleanor, who nodded, and he said, Mrs. Donnelly's mental health struggles, her inability to manage the household finances, her erratic behavior that necessitated medical intervention. And I felt anger flash through me, but Patricia squeezed my arm gently and opened her own folder. I have documentation that contradicts every claim you just made." And she methodically laid out evidence. My employment records showing excellent performance, my bank statements proving responsible financial management, my medical records from Dr. Palmer showing perfect mental and physical health, screenshots of Warren's calendar showing secret meetings, and finally, the email from Attorney Caldwell discussing conservatorship and asset seizure. And the room went silent as she slid copies across the table to Richard, and I watched Warren's face drain of color as Eleanor's expression hardened into something cold and calculating, and Richard read through the documents, his professional mask slipping slightly, and he said quietly to Warren, "Is this accurate? Were you pursuing conservatorship?" And Warren tried to deflect. "It was just a consultation. We were exploring options." And Patricia said firmly, "You were building a case to have my client declared incompetent so you could control her assets without divorce proceedings. That's not consultation, that's conspiracy, and it's potentially criminal." And Eleanor actually laughed, a harsh sound. "This is ridiculous. Natalie is clearly unstable if she's making these accusations." But Patricia slid another paper across, the recording permissions form from the state showing that single-party consent was legal. And she said, "I have audio recordings of conversations as well, including threats and coercion, all obtained legally." And that was a bluff. I hadn't recorded anything. But they didn't know that, and I watched them realize their carefully constructed plan was falling apart because they documented their own schemes, made their conspiracy tangible through emails and appointments and witnessed statements. And Richard set down his pen and said to Warren, "We need to talk privately." Now, the private conversation lasted 20 minutes, and when they returned, Richard's entire approach had changed, professional distance replacing aggressive confidence, and he said, "My client is prepared to negotiate a fair division of assets in an uncontested divorce." And Eleanor actually gasped, "Richard, we're paying you to." And he cut her off with icy politeness. "Mrs. Donnelly, I'm advising my client based on the legal reality of his situation, which is not favorable." And Warren looked smaller somehow, defeated, and Patricia said, "I'm glad we can approach this reasonably." And she outlined terms, 50-50 division of all marital assets, Natalie keeps her retirement account fully, no alimony requested by either party, house to be sold, and proceeds divided equally. And Warren signed preliminary agreement right there, his hand shaking slightly, and Eleanor tried once more. "Warren, you can't just..." And he said tiredly, "Mom, please, just stop." And it was the first time I'd ever heard him push back against her, and she looked at him with something like disgust. And after they left, Patricia turned to me and said, "That went better than expected. They knew they had no position to argue from." And I felt relief wash through me, but also a strange emptiness, because ending a 12-year marriage in 90 minutes of legal negotiation felt surreal. And Patricia added, "They'll probably try to renegotiate once they've consulted other attorneys. But with the evidence we have, no lawyer will advise them to fight." And she was right. Over the next 2 weeks, several threatening letters arrived, attempts to frighten me into accepting less, claims that my evidence was inadmissible, accusations of defamation. But Patricia responded to each one calmly, with facts and law. And slowly their protests quieted as they realized the truth was documented, undeniable, and no amount of manipulation could erase what they'd put in writing. And I started sleeping better, eating normally again, feeling like myself for the first time in months, and my coworker asked if I seemed happier, and I realized I was. That the absence of constant surveillance and control felt like breathing properly after years of slow suffocation. The final divorce hearing was remarkably brief, just 30 minutes in front of a judge who reviewed the settlement agreement, asked if we both understood and agreed to the terms, and declared our marriage dissolved, effective immediately. And I walked out of that courthouse on a bright September morning feeling lighter than I had in years. And I didn't gloat or celebrate or say anything cruel to Warren, who looked genuinely devastated standing on those courthouse steps. And Eleanor was conspicuously absent, hadn't attended the hearing, though she'd attended every other meeting. And later I learned through Patricia that several of Eleanor's friends had quietly distanced themselves after learning what she'd orchestrated. that her book club had stopped including her, that her church group had grown chilly, because controlling your son's wife through manufactured mental health claims didn't sit well even with people who might have sympathized with her traditional values. And Warren called me once a few days later, just to say he was sorry. That he wished things had been different. And I believed he meant it. But I also understood that regret without accountability is just sadness about consequences. And I told him I hoped he'd find clarity eventually, and hung up. And I didn't block his number or change my locks dramatically, or do any of the theatrical gestures of anger. I just moved forward quietly. And Patricia said something during our final meeting that stayed with me. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it just looks like truth being believed, and boundaries being respected. And I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. About how I'd won not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed. Not by matching their manipulation, but by documenting facts and demanding respect. And there was satisfaction in that, deep and lasting, the kind that didn't require them to suffer, just required me to be free. The quiet consequences unfolded over months in ways I only heard about through mutual acquaintances and occasional glimpses. Warren moved into a small apartment, having to rebuild his life without his mother's financial safety net, which apparently had always supplemented his irregular income, and he took a steady job with a logistics company, less glamorous than sales, but more reliable. And someone told me he seemed different. Quieter, more thoughtful, like the divorce had forced growth he'd avoided while married. And Eleanor faced her own reckoning, as word spread through their social circles about what she'd attempted. Not through me saying anything, but through the simple fact that people talk, and the truth has weight. And families who'd once sought her advice started declining invitations. Church committees found reasons to restructure without her leadership, and her book club quietly disbanded, though I suspected it just reformed without her. And I felt no triumph hearing this, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement that actions have costs and control always comes with a price. And one of Warren's cousins called me months later to apologize, saying she'd believed Eleanor's narrative about my instability and felt ashamed now, understanding how deliberately I'd been maligned. And I thanked her for calling, but told her I held no grudges, that I understood how convincing Eleanor could be, how reasonable manipulation appears when packaged as concern. And I meant it, because staying angry would have meant they still had power over my emotional life, and I'd worked too hard to be free to chain myself to bitterness now. And my sister visited that fall and said I looked different, healthier, more present, like I'd been underwater for years and finally surfaced. And I realized she was right, that marriage hadn't been slowly killing me, but it had been slowly erasing me, turning down my volume until I was nearly silent. And now I was learning to speak at full voice again. To make decisions without second-guessing. To exist without seeking permission. The house sold in November for slightly more than expected, and I signed the papers in Patricia's office while Warren signed remotely through his attorney. And when the proceeds were deposited, $170,000 into my new account, representing my half, I stared at that number, understanding it wasn't just money but possibility. And I paid Patricia's fees immediately, thanking her not just for her legal work but for believing me, for seeing through the narrative Eleanor and Warren had constructed and recognizing manipulation for what it was. And she hugged me, breaking professional distance, and said, "You did this, Natalie. You protected yourself. I just provided the framework." And I took 2 weeks off work and drove to Colorado to stay with my sister, spending long days hiking and talking and crying sometimes, because grief is complicated even when divorce is necessary. And she let me process everything without judgment. And one night, over wine on her back deck, she said, "I always thought something was off with Warren and Eleanor, the way they talked about you like you weren't fully capable, but I figured you'd tell me if you needed help." And I explained that I hadn't known how to ask, hadn't even fully recognized what was happening until I overheard that conversation in my own kitchen, and she held my hand and said, "You know now, that's what matters." And when I returned home, I started looking for a new place to live, something smaller, something entirely mine with no shared history. and I found a bright two-bedroom condo near downtown with huge windows and no memories. And I signed the lease and moved in with just my personal belongings, leaving behind the furniture Warren wanted. And I bought a new bed and a comfortable couch and some plants, and I arranged everything exactly how I wanted it, without consulting anyone, without compromising, without making myself smaller to fit someone else's vision. And the first night I slept there, I woke up at 2 a.m. in a panic, thinking I'd forgotten something important. And then I realized the panic was just unfamiliar peace, the silence of not being monitored or managed or controlled, and I smiled in the darkness and went back to sleep. Eleanor's letter arrived in January, forwarded through Patricia's office, and I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won, and her handwriting was precise on expensive stationery as she wrote that she'd been reflecting on recent events and wanted to clear the air, which I immediately recognized as non-apology language. And she wrote, "I may have overstepped in my concern for Warren's well-being, but you must understand a mother's love for her son," positioning her manipulation as maternal devotion, and she continued, "I hope you're doing well and that perhaps someday we can have coffee and move past this unfortunate situation." And the word unfortunate made me laugh because it reduced months of calculated cruelty to an awkward misunderstanding. And nowhere in that letter did she actually apologize. Nowhere did she acknowledge the harm caused or take responsibility for orchestrating a campaign to have me declared incompetent. Nowhere did she recognize that her actions had been wrong, rather than just unsuccessful, and I read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer where I kept documents I didn't want to throw away but didn't need to revisit. And I didn't respond because Eleanor wasn't seeking forgiveness or accountability. She was seeking access, wanting to reestablish connection, not for reconciliation, but because being cut off from knowing my life bothered her. And I understood that control takes many forms. That staying in contact with someone who tried to destroy your autonomy was just another way of letting them maintain power, and I was done with that. Done with relationships that required me to ignore my own reality. Done with family that functioned through manipulation disguised as love. And I felt no guilt choosing silence, no obligation to make Eleanor feel better about consequences she'd earned. And when my mother called asking if I'd received Eleanor's letter and shouldn't I respond to be the bigger person, I said gently, being the bigger person doesn't mean letting people who hurt you back into your life. Sometimes it means respecting yourself enough to maintain boundaries. And my mother went quiet, then said she understood, and I believed she was trying to. Warren showed up at my workplace in March, not inside, but waiting in the parking lot by my car. And my initial instinct was fear, but he raised his hands immediately seeing my expression, saying, "I'm not here to cause problems, I promise. I just needed to talk to you face to face." And I kept my distance, keys in hand, phone accessible, and he said, "I've been in therapy, real therapy, not the setup Mom arranged. And I'm starting to understand what I did, what we did." And I waited, and he continued, "I let my mother control my marriage. I let her convince me that you needed managing rather than partnership. I prioritized her approval over your well-being. And I almost destroyed you to avoid disappointing her." And his voice cracked slightly, and I saw genuine remorse there, not just regret about consequences, but actual understanding of harm caused. And he said, "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not asking you to forgive me, or give me another chance, or even to not hate me. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. And I'm sorry." And we stood there in that parking lot with March wind cutting through our coats, and I felt the anger I'd been carrying loosen slightly, because accountability was what I'd needed, not from him necessarily, but from the universe. Confirmation that what happened to me was wrong and recognized as wrong. And I said, "Thank you for saying that." And he nodded. "You deserved so much better than I gave you. I hope you're happy now." And I surprised myself by saying, "I am, I really am," and meaning it, and he smiled sadly and walked away. And I got in my car and drove home thinking about closure, about how it doesn't erase what happened but sometimes allows you to set it down. And I'd been carrying Warren and Eleanor's betrayal like a weight for months. And his apology didn't make it disappear, but it did make it lighter somehow. Proof that leaving had been right, that standing up for myself had mattered. And I let myself acknowledge that I didn't hate him, that hate requires energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. And I chose indifference instead, chose to remember the marriage as a chapter that taught me what I wouldn't tolerate, rather than as a tragedy that defined me. I celebrated my 44th birthday in June with my sister, her husband, 3 close friends from work, and a coworker's golden retriever, who crashed the party and ended up being the highlight. And we had dinner at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, but Warren had dismissed as too trendy, and I ate excellent pasta and drank good wine and laughed until my cheeks hurt. And later we walked through the downtown park as the sun set, and my friend Paula said, "You know what's different about you now? You take up space. Before, you were always kind of folded in on yourself, making yourself smaller. Now you just exist fully." And I thought about that, about how I'd spent years minimizing myself, my opinions, my preferences, my voice, because taking up space felt aggressive or demanding. And I'd learned in that marriage that being small was safer, that disappearing meant less conflict, except it also meant less life. And now I lived in a home I'd chosen, decorated exactly how I wanted, kept at whatever temperature felt comfortable, and I made decisions daily without consulting anyone. And that freedom was still novel enough to feel remarkable. And I'd gotten a promotion at work, after my performance review showed I was exceeding expectations. And my supervisor had said my confidence seemed stronger, my presentations more assertive, and I realized I'd been performing competence tentatively before, always ready to defer or apologize. And now I just did my job well without qualifying it. And I'd started taking a pottery class on Tuesday evenings, just because it interested me. And I joined a hiking group that met Saturday mornings. And I was building a life that looked nothing like my marriage but everything like myself. And some days I still felt grief for the years I'd given to a relationship that diminished me. But mostly I felt grateful that I'd found my way out before more years disappeared, before the erosion of self became irreversible. The hardest lesson I learned came gradually, not in one revelation but accumulated through months of reflection and therapy of my own. That betrayal doesn't always announce itself loudly, doesn't always arrive obviously cruel or violent. Sometimes it wears the mask of concern and speaks the language of love while slowly, methodically dismantling your autonomy. And the most dangerous part was how reasonable it had seemed in small increments. How Eleanor's suggestions seemed like helpful advice. How Warren's consultation with lawyers seemed like responsible planning. How their narrative about my fragility seemed like worried family members trying to help. And I understood now that I'd been groomed for months, prepared psychologically to accept their control, taught to doubt my own perceptions and defer to their judgment. And the cruelty wasn't in any single action, but in the sustained campaign to make me question my own competence, my own reality. And I thought about other women who might be experiencing something similar, who might be hearing concern that's actually criticism, receiving help that's actually control, being loved in ways that require them to shrink. And I wished I could tell them what I'd learned. That intuition is valid. That unease is information. That you don't owe anyone your power just because they're family. That cooperation isn't weakness, but forced compliance isn't cooperation. And that protecting yourself isn't selfish or dramatic or paranoid, it's survival. And I understood why I hadn't recognized the manipulation sooner, how insidious it had been. How I'd been the metaphorical frog in slowly boiling water, never noticing each degree of temperature increase, until I was nearly cooked. And I forgave myself for not seeing it earlier, for staying as long as I did, for believing their version of events before I believed my own experience. Because that's what manipulation does, it makes you complicit in your own diminishment. And breaking free required not just leaving, but reclaiming my own narrative. Trusting my own perceptions, believing my own worth. What betrayal by loved ones taught me about life is this: that silence can be survival, but also strategy. That preparing is more powerful than reacting. That documentation matters more than emotion when defending yourself. That boundaries aren't cruelty but self-respect made visible. And that love never requires you to surrender your voice, your competence, or your autonomy. And I learned that family isn't automatically sacred just because you share blood or history, that some relationships are toxic, even when they look supportive from outside. That concern can be weaponized, and care can become control. And walking away from people who diminish you isn't failure, it's clarity. And I learned that I'm stronger than I believed, more capable than I was taught to think, more deserving of respect than I'd been convinced to accept. And the empire Eleanor and Warren tried to build on, my silence collapsed, not because I fought back loudly, but because I refused to sign away my power, because I prepared quietly instead of reacting emotionally, because I gathered evidence instead of making accusations, because I believed my own reality even when they told me it was wrong. And now, I live in a home that's entirely mine, work at a job that values my contributions, spend time with people who celebrate rather than diminish me, and I make decisions daily without fear of being questioned or overridden or managed. And some nights I still wake up startled, checking for danger that's no longer there, my body remembering what my mind has released. But mostly, I sleep well, deeply, safely. And I know that if I'd stayed, if I'd signed those papers, if I'd accepted their narrative that I needed managing, I would have lost myself completely, become a ghost in my own life. And instead I walked away with my identity intact. And that freedom to be fully myself without apology or permission is worth more than any marriage, any family approval, any pretense of peace that requires my silence. And I end this story not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Because betrayal taught me discernment, loss taught me boundaries, and surviving taught me that I was never as powerless as they tried to convince me I was. And that knowledge, that unshakable certainty of my own capability and worth, is mine forever, earned through fire, proven through survival, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.